So today you'll be hearing from Deanna Hausman, and she's a graduate student in microbiology and will be giving a talk about coral. So with that, I'll hand it over to her.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everybody. I am really excited to be here. This is my first time ever presenting at one of these events, and I am super excited to talk to you guys today about coral bleaching and a really fascinating relationship between coral and algae. But first, let me just introduce myself really quick. My name is Deanna, and I'm a PhD student in the microbiology program here at Yale. I'm originally from Texas. I grew up in Houston, which is around on the coast. And then I went to college at the University of Texas in Austin, which is in kind of central Texas. And at college, I had the opportunity to do some really cool research. I studied different ways of diagnosing cancer. I did the coral research I'm going to be presenting on today. And I even got to spend a summer studying how ecosystems respond to oil spills. And part of that involves going out on a boat and catching these little sharks so we could put tags on them and study and track how their populations were recovering from the oil spills. So that was really fun. And then after college, I moved to Seattle for a year where I studied how bacteria defend themselves against viruses. And finally, I made my way here and started my PhD work. I work in a lab at the School of Medicine where I study a bacteria that normally is totally harmless, can't really hurt us, but in very certain circumstances can actually make people really sick. And kind of my overarching research interest is how can microorganisms be harmful or helpful in different situations? How can they change to be either harmful or helpful? And believe it or not, that is actually a really relevant question when it comes to coral, and that is what we're going to be talking about today. So first, just a little bit about coral. So even before I ever studied it, I absolutely loved coral. Growing up, I loved going to the aquarium. I watched Finding Nemo a lot and nature documentaries, and was just absolutely in awe of coral because of how beautiful it is and how full of life it seems to be. And the more I learn about coral, the more I'm just absolutely amazed by it and the importance it has to kind of life on Earth. Something that I think is absolutely amazing is that reefs make up only around 1% of the ocean in terms of space, but they're home to around 25% or a quarter of all ocean species, which I think is absolutely mind-boggling when you think of all the different species that live in the ocean. And they're very important to these organisms because they're an important habitat and food source for many different creatures. They're also very important to humans. Reefs can protect coastlines from washing away if sea levels rise or if waves become really strong. And coral reefs have been an important source of discovery for new medicines and compounds that we use because of how much diversity of life lives on coral reefs, which I think is really amazing. But one question I have for y'all is, what actually is coral? In this picture, I have arrows pointing to different types of coral in this picture. So what are we looking at? Is coral a rock, an animal, a plant? You guys can put it in the chat what you think. I'm seeing plant, not plants, animal. Yeah, so several different answers. Skeletons, that's a good answer. We'll talk about that more. Yeah, so I think kind of all these answers would make sense. They're hard, coral are hard like rocks. They look like they have branches like plants, but in fact, coral are actually animals. and are most closely related to jellyfish and anemones. And to understand that a little better, it helps to zoom in on coral. So if you could look at a piece of coral, say under a magnifying glass, you would see that coral is actually made up of hundreds of thousands of these little tree-looking things. And each one of these is actually a tiny little animal called a coral polyp. So these are, really similar to anemones, or kind of an upside down jellyfish in a way. They have tentacles that they use to filter feed, and a mouth and stomach that they use to eat. And some people in the chat were saying skeleton, or they were saying that a coral is a skeleton, and that is also really true. These little polyps make this hard skeleton around themselves, which builds up kind of the body of the coral, and over generations and generations of the lives of these little polyps, the whole coral can grow. And essentially these generations grow on top of each other, make more skeleton. And so when you look at a coral, you could be looking at something that has actually existed for thousands of years, which I think is really amazing, even though these polyps themselves don't live very long. And then if you zoomed in even closer on a polyp and looked at it, say, under a microscope, you would see that there are even tinier organisms inside the polyp. So within the cells of the polyp are these tiny single-celled algae known as zooxanthellae, and they live inside the cells of the polyp. And that might sound kind of freaky, you know, like, I don't know if I would want anything living in my cells, but this relationship is really important, and it is actually a mutualistic relationship. And this type of relationship occurs when two organisms of different species are in a close relationship where both members benefit, and the benefit provided by the relationship is greater than the costs of the relationship. And these types of relationships are found all throughout the tree of life. And you might actually be in a mutualistic relationship yourself. Say, if you have a pet, you give your pet food and shelter and love, and they give you back love and are really fun to be around. And so both of you guys are happier because, you're in this relationship, and pets are really fun. So this is kind of what happens with the coral and zooxanthellae. So like I said, zooxanthellae are tiny single-celled algae, and algae are essentially types of plants. So they're able to live in the cells of the coral and perform photosynthesis. And all of the nutrients that they make that they don't, just need to live themselves, they give to the coral. And this is how the coral get the vast majority, around 90% of the nutrients that coral need to live. All is thanks to the zooxanthellae. They also filter wastes from the coral to keep them healthy, and they give coral their color. So if you're ever looking at a picture of a coral reef and you're like, wow, this is beautiful, those colors are amazing, you can thank the zooxanthellae for that. That is one of the things they do. Then in return, the coral gives zooxanthellae some of the nutrients they need to perform photosynthesis, and they also give the zooxanthellae protection, so they're not just floating in the water where they can be eaten. Another thing that I think is absolutely amazing that coral can do for the zooxanthellae is that they can actually glow. Coral can make fluorescent proteins, which essentially means that these proteins are able to glow in the dark. And they do this to provide light for the zooxanthellae that they can use to perform photosynthesis. So this is really important, especially for coral that live deeper in the water where sunlight can't reach as well. Essentially, these coral glow and essentially make their own sunlight to help the zooxanthellae better perform photosynthesis, which I think is absolutely amazing. And these pictures are so cool. So this seems like an awesome relationship, super cool, but something we're seeing as scientists is that across the ocean, this relationship seems to be falling apart. Across the ocean, we're seeing coral that normally have zooxanthellae have those zooxanthellae leave. And I think it's really important to kind of make it clear that in this situation, the zooxanthellae are in fact actually leaving, going out of the coral. They're not just dying, they're actually separating, which is kind of interesting. And when this happens, we say that coral have bleached. So coral that would normally, be colorful becomes this ghostly white. And that's because, like I said at the beginning, one of the things that zooxanthellae do is give coral their color. So when they're not there, this is kind of the state that coral are in. And I think it's important to note that coral that have bleached are alive, but they're essentially starving because, like I said, zooxanthellae provide most of the nutrients that coral need. So yeah, these coral are essentially in a state of starvation. If they get new zooxanthellae, these coral can actually come back and be healthy again. But while they're in this bleached state, they're very vulnerable. As I said, they're starving and they become much more likely to die if conditions become more stressful. And these coral are also more susceptible to disease. So this is a very dangerous situation for coral that unfortunately is becoming more and more common across the ocean. So why would the zooxanthellae leave the coral? Coral do all this cool stuff for zooxanthellae. They seem like, they're like living their best life. Why would the zooxanthellae leave? Well, to start thinking about this, I think it's important to go back to the definition of mutualism, which is that this kind of relationship only works when the benefits of this relationship are greater than the costs. So if situations change, either in the environment or in the organisms themselves, this might change and the benefits of the relationship no longer outweigh the costs. So for our breakout room, I want us to think about this a little more. And I want us to consider one of the most famous and awesome mutualistic relationships, that of the clownfish and the anemone. So as y'all probably or maybe know, anemones are usually able to sting fish, but clownfish make this protective coat that protects them from being stung by the anemone. So they're able to live in the anemone, and they help the anemone by cleaning wastes and parasites from it, scaring away predators that might want to eat the anemone, and they provide food for the anemone in terms of their waste. And then in response, the anemone provides protection to the clownfish. It stings predators that might want to eat the clownfish. And whenever it does sting a fish, that provides food for the clownfish. So this, again, is another really cool relationship. But for our breakout room, I want us to think about ways in which this relationship could change. What factors, either in the environment or with the fish or anemones themselves, could change that could make this relationship less beneficial to either the clownfish or the anemone and cause this relationship to break apart. And I want to make it clear that for this breakout room discussion, there's no real right or wrong answers. These are kind of hypotheticals, but I do want us to think about ways in which these relationships could change, because conditions in biology are kind of always changing. So yeah, we'll go into our breakout rooms and come back together very soon. Cool. Well, I hope that breakout room was interesting for you guys. Kind of what I really wanted us to think about, and kind of some of the discussion we had in my breakout room, is that for a relationship like this to work, a mutualistic relationship, it's important that both members of the relationship are getting some benefit from it, and that different changes that can cause one member to get hurt can cause the whole relationship to essentially fall apart. And I think it's important also to note that in a relationship like this, like, they work because at the end of the day, both partners are like doing their best to survive. And they're going to kind of do that if it means staying in the relationship. But if it breaks down, they still have to kind of do whatever they can to survive. So these are kind of some of the ideas we're going to be thinking about with the coral and zooxanthellae for the rest of this talk. So yeah, we're back to our question. Why would the zooxanthellae leave the coral? Why would this relationship break down? Well, as I said at the beginning, zooxanthellae are algae. They're able to perform photosynthesis, and normally this is what happens. They're living in coral, they're happy, performing photosynthesis, making food for the coral. It's all good. But if the zooxanthellae get stressed, for instance, if ocean temperatures rise, which is something that is unfortunately happening a lot nowadays, this can damage the proteins and molecules that zooxanthellae use to perform photosynthesis. And essentially this causes photosynthesis to stop. But the zooxanthellae still have like some of the molecules and energy that they would normally be using to perform photosynthesis. And these can ultimately perform harmful chemical reactions and actually produce toxic molecules, which can go out of the zooxanthellae and into the coral. And so if you think about it, this is a hugely dangerous situation for the coral because the zooxanthellae are within the cells of the coral. So they have essentially become poisonous to the coral. And this is obviously really bad and really dangerous. So how can the coral possibly respond to this? You know, they can't move around into parts of the ocean that, you know, have lower temperatures and are better for the zooxanthellae. They can't necessarily like physically fight the zooxanthellae. You know, if you're just scuba diving and looking at a coral, you might not think that the coral could really respond in any way, that they would just die. But if you look at the DNA of the coral, which is what I did in my research, this tells a different story. And you can see that the coral are really responding to this situation. So like us, coral have DNA, and their DNA is made up of different genes. And each gene you can think of as giving a different instruction to the coral. So coral can turn on different genes or turn off certain genes to give different instructions and ultimately respond in different ways. And this is something that we're able to see in the lab. This is what I did. I looked at what genes were turned on and off in different coral taken from different parts of the ocean, some of which were, you know, higher in temperature and some lower in temperature. And what we find is in situations of low stress, when the temperatures are higher than normal, but not super high, the zooxanthellae start making these toxic molecules, but the coral is actually able to respond and make proteins and molecules that they can use to capture these toxic molecules and essentially make them non-toxic and get them out of the coral. And they're actually really good at this. This is one of the ways that they're able to live in so many different environments, is that they're able to do this. But in situations of high stress, when the temperature is way higher than normal, and a lot of these molecules are getting produced, the coral essentially gets like overwhelmed with these molecules, and they can't make enough of the proteins they need to you know, make them non-harmful. So in that situation, the coral will then turn on its immune system. So like us, coral can get sick and they have an immune system that they use to respond to outside invaders. And in this situation, the zooxanthellae essentially get registered by the immune system as invaders. And the immune system can send signals to the cells containing the zooxanthellae, essentially saying, get this out of here, we can't have this anymore. And this causes the cell to essentially push the zooxanthellae out. And ultimately, this leads to the zooxanthellae having to leave the coral. So in this situation, the coral has been able to respond to the toxic molecules and save themselves from that. But you get a situation where the coral is now bleached and is back having all those problems of being starving, essentially. So coral are able to respond to bad conditions, but ultimately have to do it between kind of choosing whether they're going to be hurt by bleaching or by the toxic molecules. Essentially, what really has to happen to help coral is for the ocean temperatures to come down to normal, essentially. But this research also reveals that there is some hope for coral, that they might be able to adapt to these higher temperatures. So within a coral, there can be different types of zooxanthellae. And when ocean temperatures rise and a lot of the zooxanthellae get pushed out, there might be some individuals that are more resistant to heat, don't produce the toxic molecules, and are able to remain inside the coral. And over time, these more resistant individuals are able to reproduce and populate the coral. So over time, as these resistant zooxanthellae make up more of the population, these coral become more resistant to bleaching and can better handle if temperatures rise further, which I think is really exciting. And this research kind of reveals some ways that we might go about helping coral. For instance, by looking at what zooxanthellae are in the coral in different reefs, or by looking at what reefs seem to be responding by turning on their immune system, we can identify reefs that are most at risk for bleaching and try and help them in some ways by, for instance, moving some coral to better parts of the ocean where, you know, they might be able to be preserved and set up a new reef. We can also try to use this information by treating coral. So if we find coral that have bleached but are still alive, we might be able to treat them by introducing zooxanthellae that are more resistant to heat and ultimately bring these coral back stronger than they were before. So this is why I really loved kind of doing this work and learning about this. I think science is really cool because you not only identify and understand what certain problems are, you actually get to open the door and see different ways to try and help solve them. So with that, thank you all so much for listening. I hope this was interesting and hopefully you came away with a greater appreciation for coral and zooxanthellae and how cool they are. And I would love to answer any questions that y'all have.
Thank you so much, Deanna. I can tell from the chat that they know how cool zooxanthellae are now, and they're really excited about it, and they have a lot of questions for you about it. And so some questions that came up just in the last part of the talk are about, you talked about introducing zooxanthellae to corals to maybe try to save them. And in the chat, the students were wondering, are there ways for scientists to engineer or design zooxanthellae which can help coral react better to higher or colder temperatures? And so, or are you just looking for natural zooxanthellae?
Such a good question. Yeah, so it's kind of both. We have identified zooxanthellae, that are more resistant, but kind of in studying them, we can learn what makes them more resistant. And there are definitely scientists working on engineering them by kind of introducing the proteins or the genes that we found make zooxanthellae more resistant, or trying to engineer new mechanisms or new genes that could help zooxanthellae. Yeah, and there's also some work being done actually on the coral side as well, trying to engineer coral to be more resistant and better able to like keep their zooxanthellae inside. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, okay. And so more questions on zooxanthellae. So it seems that, the zooxanthellae can really help corals. Is there a way that zooxanthellae can also be used for humans as a way to fight off an infection or disease?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Trying to think. I haven't heard of that with zooxanthellae, but something I think is really cool is that we actually have a lot of bacteria living inside us. So zooxanthellae are tiny little algae. I don't think I've ever heard of zooxanthellae living on humans or in humans, but we do have a lot of bacteria living inside of us and on us. And a lot of these bacteria have been found to help us digest food and fight off disease. So it's kind of, another way of thinking about, ways that like things we have in common with coral. Like we both have microorganisms that can help us out and live with us.
Yeah, that's a really great comparison. And there were some other questions about the comparisons between corals and humans. So one question we had in the chat was, how can corals turn on or turn off a gene? And is turning off and on genes unique to coral? And can humans do this also in response to environmental triggers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we do to turn on and off genes, essentially genes give instructions for making proteins. Whenever we turn on genes, we use the DNA to make RNA, and that RNA ultimately goes on to give the instructions to create a protein. So yeah, this is common in like every living thing. Humans do this, zooxanthellae, coral, bacteria, everything. So different environmental triggers absolutely can cause different genes to be turned on in different situations.
Cool. That's cool to know that, I'm turning on and off genes right now, and you guys are too. I didn't know I was that cool, to be honest. Okay, so we have a lot of other questions. We have a series of questions kind of about you yourself and the field that you study. So one of the first questions we got in the chat was, what the difference is between microbiology and biology? Is it just that one uses a microscope? That's what we had one student try to answer, but what's the difference between microbiology and biology?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, microbiology is essentially a type of biology that focuses on microorganisms. So microbiologists study bacteria, which is what I study. I love bacteria. They also study viruses or small parasites. It's really interesting because microbiologists and biologists are, we use a lot of the same tools, like we're interested in genes and what they do. We do some of the same things to study things, and part of what microbiologists do does involve using microscopes. But essentially the difference really boils down to like, what are we most interested in? So different types of biologists might study humans, other animals, plants. It kind of depends on what you're most interested in.
And a follow-up question about your job in particular, do you get to scuba dive and see the coral up close?
That's a great question. So I did this, in college. This isn't what I do now. And when I was in college, in my lab, definitely. Other people in the lab would go to scuba dive. They would go every summer, I think, to Australia, and then over Christmas break, they would go to the Caribbean, which seemed so amazing. I never got to do that because I had to, you know, stay and do college. But it seemed so fun and so amazing. I did ultimately end up getting to go snorkeling one time and actually see corals in real life, which is really fun, but on vacation, not as a part of this research. Yeah, but that was something that I thought was really interesting about like doing coral research, is that it's not like a big part of it is scuba diving, but there's also really interesting things that you can learn about coral in the lab.
Okay, and so then a couple other questions about, I guess, seeing the coral, since you mentioned that you got to see them up close when you were on vacation. You mentioned that coral glow in the dark, and there are a couple questions on that. Number one, like, why do corals have fluorescent protein, and are they always glowing or only at certain times?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So with fluorescent proteins, it's not necessarily that they're like glowing all the time so that we could see them. They kind of glow in certain wavelengths of light. So how do I explain this? Yeah, they're kind of glowing in wavelengths of light that we cannot necessarily like see with the naked eye. We would need like a special light to look at the coral and see them glowing. If you guys have ever been to like a bowling alley or laser tag and seen that like if you wear white to one of those, it like seems to glow under the lights they have there. That's kind of what you would need to be able to see the coral glowing. And yeah, so they're glowing in kind of the specific types of light that zooxanthellae would need to perform photosynthesis.
And we got another question, just in comparison to coral, do you know how bright they would be in comparison to other animals? The animal in question in the chat is, does a hedgehog glow brighter than coral? However, you might not know it in units of hedgehogs, but if you know it in units of any animal.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I was hoping that, that a lot of y'all had been at the last talk and heard about the glowing hedgehogs and sharks and stuff, because turns out a lot of things glow. Who knew? The hedgehog glow brighter than a coral. What's the relative brightness? I'm not sure. I would imagine that if you could see them both, the coral might be brighter just because it's probably bigger than a hedgehog. But I am actually not so sure. Someone would need to study that. Maybe you can. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has ever compared hedgehogs and corals side by side. So that's definitely a part of the microbiology / biology, kind of a combo study that you guys can possibly partake in. And also thinking about other like interdisciplinary fields that corals are a part of, you mentioned towards the beginning of the talk that corals could be used to, that there are compounds inside corals which can be, perhaps medicinally relevant or otherwise relevant to humans. And so we had a question about like what types of compounds those are, like where you would find them, as well as some other compound related questions, as in like what types of compounds do coral thrive on? So are there other types of molecules in the ocean that coral need? Another question we had is what type of elements are in the toxic molecules? So thinking about like what makes things toxic. And so it's kind of a lot of questions, but thinking about how chemistry and corals kind of relate.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So some of the chemicals that we found in coral reefs do come from the corals. For instance, the glowing molecules are actually super important to scientists. A lot of scientists use these glowing molecules to be able to look at cells better under the microscope. Other important things found in coral reefs are medicines found from some of the other animals that live in coral reefs. So for instance, there's a drug used to treat HIV that was first discovered in, I think, a sea sponge in a coral reef. I think there's some cancer drugs that were found. I think also in sea sponges. Sea sponges seem really cool in coral reefs. But yeah, like part of it is from the coral themselves, and part of it is just if you're looking for a huge variety of compounds, like a reef is the place to go, essentially, just because so many different organisms live there. There's a question about what was the toxic molecules. That's also a really great question. So essentially, these molecules, like the scientific name for them is reactive oxygen species. And essentially these molecules are just really like unstable and like really want to react with stuff. Like they absolutely need to react with stuff like at all costs. So if they're in a cell, they're going to react with things like the DNA or you know, other proteins that the cell needs, and essentially be able to, you know, react in a way that the cell like wouldn't want, and cause damage that way. And yeah, like causing damage to DNA is obviously really bad and really dangerous. What I feel like there was another question that you said.
The other part of the question was, what compounds do coral thrive on? So like what compounds do coral need themselves?
Good question. Trying to think. So they definitely need molecules in the ocean to be able to build their skeletons. These skeletons are made of calcium carbonate, which is something that can be dissolved in the water, and definitely they use this to build their structures. Beyond that, the food that they don't get from the zooxanthellae, they're able to filter from other organisms, so like other tiny bacteria and algae in the water. What else? Those are the ones that are kind of coming to mind.
Yeah, no, thank you so very much for just showing how much chemistry there even is in microbiology. And so we have time for one final question, and this will be a fun one. But what's the coolest thing about studying marine biology / marine microbiology? What's the coolest thing?
Yeah, I guess like what's just was really amazing for me is just like oh yeah, cat, like there's a cat. Yeah, just like I guess like this research was what like really kind of set me on the path of being interested in microbiology, just because of like how much everything in the ocean is kind of connected to each other, and just how important microorganisms can be to kind of this like global process. Like coral reefs are something that impacts like pretty much like everybody on the globe. Like ocean life impacts us all in terms of, you know, what food we have, even like the air we breathe is made in a large part because of stuff in the ocean. And the fact that like so much of this could boil down to like the tiniest little organism was just absolutely fascinating to me. And yeah, is what ultimately made me really interested in microbiology.
Well, thank you again, Deanna, for showing that interest. I mean, I'm sure now all of us are interested in microbiology, at least a little bit after that amazing presentation. I learned so much about coral and about zooxanthellae as well, and the relationship they have with each other. So thank you so much again for coming here and sharing your knowledge with us tonight.